The syringe plunged deep into the median cubital vein, the plunger hissing as the pale, viscous fluid, the forced evolutionary virus, they called it, shot into his bloodstream. It wasn't the pain of the injection that registered first, but the instantaneous, profound cold that radiated outward from his elbow, a chemical frostbite spreading through his chest. Elias gasped, the air catching in his throat, smelling faintly of ozone and stale formaldehyde. His body immediately recognized the intrusion, launching a catastrophic immune response that was doomed to fail. Within minutes, the cold reversed into a furnace. His skin flushed crimson, taut and searing to the touch. The fever spiked so violently that the cheap metal cot beneath him seemed to warp and shimmer, the concrete floor appearing to breathe. Every sound became a muffled, distant roar, like listening to the world through a thick layer of water. A metallic tongue, coppery and sickeningly sweet, coated his tongue, the flavor of internal hemorrhage and accelerated metabolism. He tried to call out, but the sound that emerged was a wet, rattling croak, alien and weak. The guards outside, shadows behind the reinforced glass, did not move. They were watching the process, clinically detached from the biological catastrophe unfolding inside his skull. The pain was not simply pain. It was the biological manifestation of structural failure under immense pressure. It began deep in the marrow, a grinding, abrasive agony as the calcium matrix of his long bones dissolved and rebuilt itself faster than the nervous system could process the trauma. His femurs felt like they were being hammered into dense, igneous rock. The longitudinal growth plates, long fused in his adult body, screamed as they were reactivated, stretching the cartilage and tearing the periosteum. His jaw locked, the masseter muscles swelling until his face was unrecognizable, a mask of rigid, pulsating tissue. He could feel the individual muscle bundles in his back, the latissimus dorsi, the rhomboids snapping and refusing, doubling their volume in a matter of hours. This was not healing. This was reckless, accelerated construction performed by microscopic, viral contractors. He was being sculpted by a biological imperative that cared nothing for the integrity of his previous form. The sheer, overwhelming density of the new tissue felt like drowning in his own flesh, a suffocating weight pressing outward against his skin, threatening to burst the confining membrane. The physical agony was matched only by the terrifying erosion of his own mind. Memories began to fray at the edges, names and faces dissolving into indistinct blurs. The nuanced complexities of human thought, irony, empathy, abstract philosophy, became burdensome, irrelevant noise against the new, booming clarity of primal needs. The FEV, designed to maximize physical robustness, treated higher cognition as inefficient overhead. It was optimizing the hardware by stripping the software down to its essential operating system. He looked down at his hands, which were now enormous, calloused slabs, the fingers thick as sausages, the nails hardened into dull, yellowed keratin plates. They were not his hands. Elias was gone. In his place was a creature driven by simple, powerful vectors: hunger, dominance, and the strange, intoxicating euphoria of pure, unadulterated strength. He remembered being small, fragile, dependent. The FEV despised fragility. It was purging weakness with a vengeance. A new guttural voice echoed in the cavern of his expanding chest, a low, satisfied rumble that seemed to say, "Bigger, stronger, good." The concept of Elias felt like a dusty, discarded skin, too tight and too weak to wear. The lingering fear was replaced by a massive, aggressive impatience. He wanted to break things. He wanted space. When the fever finally broke, it left him shivering, slicked with a foul-smelling, greenish sweat that evaporated rapidly, leaving his skin rubbery and tough. He struggled to sit up, the cot groaning under the sudden, massive weight. The room's lighting, previously harsh, now seemed dull. His vision had sharpened, achieving a grotesque level of clarity. But everything possessed a slight, sickly green cast, the characteristic color staining the world like cheap paint. He reached up, his new, massive forearm scraping against the concrete ceiling of the cell, the motion effortless, despite the ceiling being 8 feet high. The skin was thick, nearly impervious, and the characteristic sickly olive hue was undeniable, even in the dim light. He examined the reflection in the polished steel of the door latch, a towering, hulking silhouette with a brow ridge like a shelf and eyes that looked too small, too distant, sunk deep into the newly formed bone structure. The transformation was complete, at least for this stage. He wasn't human anymore. He was something else, something built for the Wasteland, something terrifyingly durable. The guards finally moved, their movements slow and cautious, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and proprietary satisfaction. They opened the reinforced door, and the cold air of the laboratory rushed in, carrying the sense of disinfectant and fear. He inhaled deeply, and the fear smelled delicious. The guards, 2 skeletal figures clad in reinforced power armor that suddenly looked laughably inadequate, retreated a respectful distance. The creature standing before them, the former Elias, was a force of nature contained only by the sterile, humming walls of the facility. The cold air rushed in, a deluge of information. The metallic tongue of ozone from the power conduits, the high-pitched whine of ventilation fans, and beneath it all, the pervasive, undeniable musk of human anxiety. Fear was the loudest scent, a complex tapestry woven from adrenaline and the specific chemical signature of cortisol spiking in the bloodstream. It was intoxicating, a validation of his new, dominant status. He took a step, a motion that felt strangely light despite the immense, crushing weight of his new body. The ground accepted his mass with a low, resonating thud that traveled up his legs and settled deep in his chest. His muscles, now corded and dense, felt like compressed steel cables sheathed in rubbery, thick skin. There was no fatigue, no strain, only an endless, coiled readiness. The transformation had fundamentally rewritten the mechanics of his existence. His cardiovascular system, previously a fragile network, was now a high-pressure pump capable of flooding his tissues with oxygenated blood instantaneously, negating lactic acid buildup and traditional stamina limits. The sensory input was overwhelming, yet perfectly managed by his newly optimized brain. Every flicker of the fluorescent lights registered as a distinct pulse. The distant, rhythmic clanking of a machine 3 corridors away was sharp and clear. This hyper-awareness, however, did not lead to sensory overload. Instead, it clarified the world, stripping away the hazy filter of human perception and replacing it with pure, objective data. This was the green logic asserting itself, efficiency above all else. The complexities of human social interaction were now viewed as inefficient noise. The guards were not men. They were obstacles, or perhaps food. A third figure entered the corridor, Dr. Alistair. She approached the towering mutant with a calculated lack of fear, an attitude born of clinical detachment and the confidence that she held the leash. Subject Gamma 7. Designation: Elias. You are stable. You are successful, she stated, her voice amplified by a small speaker unit clipped to her collar, the sound grating against his hypersensitive tympanic membranes. He looked down at her. The distance felt astronomical. The brow ridge, thick and heavy, shaded his eyes, giving his face a permanent scowl. A sound escaped his throat, a deep, rumbling vibration that resonated through the concrete floor, an expression of immense, contained power. You understand the basic commands, Alistair continued, ignoring the sound. You are hungry. The FEV requires vast caloric intake to maintain this density. You will obey the feeding instructions. You will obey the containment protocols. Failure to comply results in termination. The word termination meant nothing. It was an abstract concept tied to the fragile, useless body Elias had inhabited. The new creature did not understand fragility. It understood dominance. It understood the gnawing, insistent hunger that was not just a desire for food, but a systemic imperative, the FEV demanding fuel for its continuous, microscopic restructuring of his cellular architecture. Every breath, every movement, every moment of awareness burned calories at an astronomical rate. If he did not eat, the system would begin to consume itself. This intense, overwhelming need for fuel translated directly into aggression. Alistair pointed toward a heavy steel door at the end of the corridor. Proceed through the access point. The staging area awaits. The creature hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of a sudden, deep-seated revulsion for the small, demanding voice. The green logic immediately analyzed the situation. The small one gives commands. The small one is weak. Weakness should not command strength. The instinct to seize the doctor, to crush her fragile skull between his massive fingers and silence the irritating voice, was immediate and overwhelming. It was a pure, clean impulse, unburdened by morality or consequence. But then, a strange residual echo of Elias intervened. Not morality, but conditioning. The months of confinement, the painful injections, the electric shocks used to map pain response, had programmed a rudimentary obedience loop into his core consciousness. The FEV, while maximizing strength, was pragmatic. It recognized the immediate utility of the handlers. They provided the necessary fuel. They were conduits to survival. The conflict was resolved in a microsecond. The impulse to kill was suppressed, filed away under future potential threat. The need to eat superseded the need to dominate. He moved. The steel door, designed to resist conventional explosives, was secured by a heavy magnetic lock and a biometric scanner. The creature didn't attempt the scanner. Instead, his massive hand, the fingers now thick, blunt instruments, wrapped around the recessed edge of the doorframe. The metal groaned in protest, a high, screeching sound of tortured alloy. He didn't pull. He merely flexed. The sheer isometric force generated by his arm muscles was enough to tear the frame away from the reinforced concrete wall. Dust exploded outward, and the door buckled inward like tinfoil, the heavy locking mechanism shearing off with a sound like a gunshot. Alistair did not flinch, though the guards behind her shuffled nervously. Excellent tensile strength. Efficiency rating 98%. The creature stepped over the mangled door, entering a vast, hangar-like space illuminated by banks of harsh, yellow light. The air was colder here, thicker with the smell of waste and raw meat. This was the staging area, a high-walled enclosure where the FEV subjects were housed and tested. The ground was littered with heavy, discarded equipment, broken engine blocks, twisted rebar, and the remains of what looked like heavy construction vehicles. This was his gymnasium, his proving ground. As he surveyed the area, the full scope of the FEV's physiological alterations became apparent. He was no longer dependent on the delicate balance of human chemistry. His blood, now thick and dark, carried an enhanced oxygen-binding capacity, allowing him to operate efficiently or sustain massive physical exertion indefinitely. The pain receptors, while still present, were massively damped. A deep cut, a broken bone, these would register as distant annoyances, not debilitating injuries. He felt the world through a layer of biological armor, impervious and robust. He caught sight of his reflection in a massive polished steel plating leaning against the wall. The image was terrifyingly clear. A hulking brute, skin the color of stale moss, the musculature exaggerated to near grotesque proportions. The eyes, small and intensely focused, held a predatory intelligence, but the light of Elias's humanity had been extinguished. What remained was pure, distilled survival mechanism. Alistair's voice crackled again. Test 1. locomotion and object manipulation. Subject Gamma 7. Lift the central block. She indicated a massive pitted engine block sitting in the center of the enclosure. Perhaps 3 tons of rusted iron and steel, the engine from a pre-war heavy goods hauler. He approached the block. The metal was cold and rough against his palms. He crouched, the movement fluid and surprisingly graceful for such a massive frame, and wrapped his hands around the base. The weight settled in his shoulders, a satisfying pressure. There was no struggle, no grunting effort. It was the equivalent of a man lifting a briefcase. With a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted the 3-ton block above his head. The tendons and ligaments in his arms, strengthened by the FEV's accelerated collagen synthesis, held taut, unconcerned by the stress. The act itself brought a strange, visceral pleasure, the euphoria of realized power. This was what the FEV had promised, the absolute eradication of weakness. Then, driven by the green logic's mandate for immediate feedback, he hurled the block across the hangar. It flew 20 yards before impacting the far concrete wall with a seismic crash, shattering the concrete and embedding itself halfway into the structure. Dust and pulverized stone rained down. "Observation confirmed," Alistair said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Strength quotient exceeds projected metrics. Gamma 7, you have earned your rations. Proceed to the feeding trough." The word rations triggered the hunger again, a searing, aggressive need that eclipsed all other sensations. He turned, his gaze sweeping the room until he located the source of the raw meat smell. A large, steel trough mounted low against the wall, currently being filled by a smaller, robotic arm dropping massive chunks of raw, blood-soaked meat. The creature lumbered toward the trough, the sound of his heavy footsteps echoing across the empty chamber. He didn't use his hands to pick up the food. He lowered his head and tore into the meat with powerful, newly grown incisors, ripping away chunks of muscle and tendon. The taste was metallic, rich, and intensely satisfying. As he ate, the remnants of Elias's consciousness finally, irrevocably dissolved. The shame, the horror, the lingering attachment to morality and humanity, all were consumed by the overwhelming simple reality of the FEV's mandate. He was built for the Wasteland, a perfect apex predator, a creature of overwhelming strength and simple, brutal needs. The only thing that mattered was the weight of the meat in his stomach and the growing, satisfied rumble in his chest. The concept of Elias was now less than a memory. It was a forgotten flavor, a weakness purged by the biological fire of the virus. He was Gamma 7, and he was hungry. And he was, finally, exactly what he was supposed to be. The metallic tang of the raw meat, rich with iron and the deep, satisfying salinity of fresh blood, saturated his palate. It was not merely sustenance. It was an infusion of raw kinetic energy, instantly mobilized and driven directly into the mitochondrial matrix of his new biomass. Every chew was a controlled biomechanical operation, the powerful temporalis and mass-eater muscles generating compressive forces exceeding 1,200 pounds per square inch, rendering bone fragments and dense collagen fibers into an easily assimilated slurry. He ate until a polymer trough was scraped clean, the rhythmic sound of his powerful gulping and the wet, tearing noise of the mandibular action echoing in the vast, sterile expanse of the containment hangar. When he finally lifted his massive head, a thin smear of crimson across his jawline, the aggressive hunger had subsided, replaced by a profound, heavy sense of satiation and the low, internal resonance of accelerated anabolic growth. The green logic, the core programming of his viral modification, processed the caloric intake instantly. It calculated the energy reserves, noted the structural integrity of the newly synthesized actin and myosin fibers, and registered the ongoing rapid ossification of the skeletal structure, driven by massive hormonal surges. This process was a continual low-level ache, not unpleasant, but a constant reminder of the internal furnace that defined him now. His skin, once soft human epidermis, was now a thick leathery hide, the color of spoiled olives, stretched taut over slabs of dense irradiated muscle. He felt the texture of the air against it, dry, cool, and carrying the faint, sharp smell of ozone from the facility's high-efficiency ventilation system. Gamma 7. Alistair's voice cut through the silence, flat and precise, emanating from the shielded observation booth. Metabolic rate remains elevated post-feeding. Initiate Test 2. Environmental stress tolerance. Thermal exposure, level 3. A low resonant hum emanated from the ceiling. He instinctively tracked the source, a series of high-output infrared emitters mounted high above, calibrated for rapid temperature ingress. Within seconds, the localized temperature in his immediate vicinity began to climb sharply. Elias would have sweated profusely, panicked, or sought shade. Gamma 7 merely stood still, his core temperature stable. The heat intensified, pressing against his skin like a physical weight. The temperature gauge in the corner of the enclosure, visible in his enhanced peripheral vision, climbed past 150 degrees Fahrenheit, then 200, the air thick and viscous with thermal energy. He felt the rapid desiccation of ambient moisture, but the green logic had radically re-engineered his homeostatic controls. His massive blood volume, nearly double the human baseline, acted as an optimized internal coolant reservoir, driven by powerful ventricular action. The dermal layer, now a dense matrix of keratin and cross-linked proteins, initiated controlled peripheral vasodilation, distributing the thermal load efficiently. The heat only served to activate a deeper, more primal layer of the green logic. Adapt, endure, neutralize threat. There was no pain, only sensation. He registered the thermal energy impinging on his form, measured the rate of ingress, and waited for the point of structural failure. It never came. The heat peaked at 255 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to instantly cauterize unprotected human flesh, and then stabilized. He felt the slight crisping of the outermost epidermal layer, a negligible loss of moisture, but beneath that, the dense tissue remained fully operational, the core temperature holding steady at 99.8 degrees. Tolerance confirmed, Alistair stated, the hum shutting off, replaced by the faint click of cooling metal. Test 3. Auditory and psychological stressors. Gamma 7. Focus on the wall directly opposite you. He complied, his gaze locking onto the scarred concrete where the engine block had impacted months prior. A sudden, piercing shriek filled the hangar, a pure sine wave blasted at an ungodly volume, designed to overload the human auditory system and induce immediate disorientation and nausea. Elias would have clapped his hands over his ears, his body convulsing in agony from the neurological feedback. Gamma 7's response was entirely different. The sound hammered against the dense, calcified cartilage of his outer ears, vibrating the very bones of his skull. The green logic did not perceive the sound as pain or an attack. It perceived it as pure data. The frequency, a targeted 6.5 kilohertz, the amplitude, 140 decibels, and the precise source coordinates were mapped instantaneously. The viral modification had subtly rewired his acoustic processing centers, establishing a high-pass filter that dampened non-critical input. The neurological pathways responsible for human emotional distress were deactivated. The sound wave was merely a quantifiable pressure oscillation. It was a distraction, an irritant, but it failed to penetrate the core operational systems. He stood motionless for 10 agonizing seconds of pure auditory assault. When the sound finally cut off, the residual ringing in the air was minimal. His mind was clear, unclouded by vertigo or nausea. The green logic had cataloged the incident as high-frequency irritant, negligible threat potential. Remarkable, Alistair murmured, a rare flicker of something approaching professional satisfaction in her tone. The auditory dampening is nearly absolute. Gamma 7, we are moving to the final stage of immediate conditioning. You have proven your physical superiority. Now, we test your utility. The massive steel door at the far end of the enclosure hissed open, revealing a smaller, secondary containment cell. Inside, huddled on the floor, was a man. He was thin, dressed in tattered remnants of pre-war clothing, his face pale and etched with starvation and terror. He was not a test subject. He was a raider captured from the nearby ruins, deemed expendable and useful only for this purpose. The sight of the man triggered the last, faint echo of Elias. A ghost of recognition, the memory of shared humanity, the social contract, the prohibition against murder flickered in the deep recesses of his mind. It was a weak, dying signal, like static on a radio channel that was about to be abandoned forever. The green logic intercepted this signal immediately. It analyzed the huddled figure. Low mass, low threat, high caloric potential, and most importantly, designated target. The flicker of empathy was categorized in the system's logs as inefficient calculation. Delete. Gamma 7, Alistair commanded, the voice amplified and resonating with authority. The entity in the secondary containment cell is a liability. It consumes resources and poses a potential future threat. Eliminate the liability. The word liability resonated perfectly with the green logic. The raider was weak, slow, and frightened. Weakness was the antithesis of the viral design. Weakness was contamination. He began to move. He did not run. The massive bulk of his body was too heavy for unnecessary speed. He simply strode forward, the ground vibrating slightly with each heavy footfall. The raider, seeing the immense, olive-skinned horror approaching, scrambled backward, whimpering, his hands held up in a futile gesture of defense. "Please no, I didn't do anything. I just want out." The raider choked out, his voice cracking with pure, debilitating fear. Gamma 7 reached the dividing line. He did not pause. The raider was already trying to flatten himself against the far wall. The massive figure reached out a hand-to-hand the size of a dinner plate, the fingers thick and powerful, and wrapped it around the raider's skull. The resistance was non-existent. The raider's cervical vertebrae were brittle, his neck a fragile conduit. There was a brief, wet, sickening crunch, the sound of crushed bone and ruptured cartilage, a sound swallowed quickly by the hangar's acoustics as the hand closed with overwhelming force. The raider's body went instantly slack, a useless sack of flesh and bone, his neural activity ceasing within milliseconds. Gamma 7 held the corpse aloft for a brief moment, assessing the result. The task was complete. The liability was neutralized. The green logic registered a successful operation, a clean, efficient removal of an inferior biological unit, cataloging the energy expended versus the objective achieved. There was no rage, no malice, no triumph, only the cold satisfaction of a mechanism performing its function flawlessly. He dropped the body. It hit the concrete with a dull, heavy thud. Alistair's voice was the only sound. Observation confirmed. Aggression and obedience protocols are nominal. Gamma 7, you have achieved optimal conditioning metrics. You are now fully operational. The transformation was complete. Elias was gone. The creature standing in the enclosure, smelling faintly of blood, ozone, and irradiated concrete, was Gamma 7. He looked down at the corpse, not with curiosity, but with the detached contemplation of a highly effective tool examining the residue of its work. The world was now a place of simple, brutal equations. Mass times velocity equals impact. Calories in, energy out. Weakness equals death. Strength equals survival. And in the center of that equation, dominating every variable, was the overwhelming, undeniable truth of his viral modification. He was the highest calculation, the perfect instrument of the Wasteland. He was ready. The green logic was not a philosophy. It was a thermodynamic imperative. It registered the cessation of the Raider's life not as a moral event, but as an expenditure of energy justified by the removal of a drain on the system. The residual heat radiating from the cooling corpse was catalogued. The faint metallic tong of spilled blood was merely another data point in the newly calibrated olfactory array. Elias had possessed a complex, inefficient nervous system that prioritized sentimentality and self-preservation through calculated risk aversion. Gamma-7 possessed a system optimized for direct action and absolute dominance. The old brain had been a tangled wire loom. The new one was a solid-state processor running on pure, cold efficiency. He turned his head, the movement requiring a conscious, heavy effort toward the source of the command. Alistair stood behind the reinforced glass, a pale, fragile thing surrounded by buzzing lights and delicate instruments. Gamma-7 categorized Alistair as controller, necessary, temporary. The man was weak, easily crushed, yet he held the key to the larger operational parameters. His voice, though synthesized and amplified, carried the necessary directives. The sensory world of Gamma-7 was a coarse, vibrant tapestry of immediate physical data. The air, previously perceived as a neutral medium, was now a dense soup of particulates. Dust motes floating in the hangar's light, the sharp, ionized smell of the electrical conduits, the faint, sickening sweet odor of decaying organic matter hidden beneath the concrete. His vision, while lacking the subtle color gradients Elias had known, possessed a brutal clarity for movement and contrast. The shadows were deeper, the edges of objects sharper, the infrared signature of the facility's cooling pipes glowing with a dull, useful heat. The human world of nuance and soft edges had been replaced by a high-definition, high-contrast reality designed for hunting. His internal temperature was elevated, maintained by a constant, low-frequency anabolic hum that vibrated through his colossal muscle mass. His skin, thick and olive drab, was less skin and more a flexible, dense armor, impervious to the minor abrasions that would have crippled Elias. He felt the weight of himself, a crushing, undeniable density that anchored him to the earth. To move was to exert force against the world, and the world yielded. Alistair spoke again, the words echoing the core FEV directive. The Master requires infrastructure. He requires instruments of purity. You are the vanguard, Gamma-7. Your conditioning is finalized. The memories of Elias are an inefficient calculation. Delete. Gamma-7 processed the command. The flicker of Elias, a useless, fleeting image of a dusty road and a forgotten name, was instantly overridden. The FEV had not just enhanced his body. It had rewritten the operating system of his consciousness. The viral cascade had broken down the complex, non-essential neural pathways responsible for abstract thought, empathy, and long-term, non-survival memories. What remained was a streamlined, powerful engine for tactical execution. The memories of Elias were now just corrupted data clusters, irrelevant static against the clear transmission of the green logic. Understood, Gamma-7 rumbled, the sound originating deep in his massive chest cavity, a resonant, gravelly vibration that felt more like a geological event than speech. Alistair smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. Excellent. Observe the strength metrics. We have calibrated your output for maximum efficiency. The scientist gestured toward a section of the enclosure wall, a thick slab of reinforced concrete, roughly 3 feet square, set into the hangar structure. It was an unnecessary test. Gamma-7 knew. He already felt the kinetic potential coiled within his structure. His bone density was equivalent to compressed ceramic. His musculature, a network of thick, fibrous cables capable of generating torque far exceeding the limits of conventional biology. His hands, still stained with the Raider's blood, flexed involuntarily. The sensation was one of absolute, effortless power. He approached the wall. He did not brace, nor did he calculate the angle of attack. He simply extended his arm, and placed his palm flat against the cold, rough concrete surface. The contact was jarringly immediate. He registered the granular texture of the aggregate, the subtle vibration of the facility's ventilation system running through the material. Then he pushed. It was not a strenuous effort. It was the simple application of overwhelming force. The concrete did not crack or chip. It failed catastrophically. The rebar within the slab groaned in protest, twisting and snapping as the matrix around it disintegrated. The metal shrieked against the pressure, a high-pitched, desperate sound instantly muffled by the sheer density of Gamma 7's hand wrapped around the material. With a sickening, wet crunch, the entire slab tore free from the main structure, leaving a gaping, ragged hole in the wall. Dust erupted in a choking cloud, smelling of pulverized stone and friction. Gamma 7 held the 3-foot cube of ruined concrete aloft for a moment, examining the result. The weight was negligible. The effort expended was minimal. The objective demonstrating superior physical capability was achieved. He tossed the slab aside. It impacted the floor with the sound of a small explosion, shattering further into heavy, useless chunks. Optimal. Alistair breathed, clearly impressed despite his practiced detachment. The FEV has stabilized your muscular hypertrophy at the 98th percentile. You are physically superior to all but the master himself. The door to the enclosure hissed open, the air pressure shifting slightly, bringing with it the faint, complex odors of the rest of the facility, the smell of stale air, distant oil, and the faint chemical scent of other, less successful experiments decaying in hidden chambers. It is time for integration, Alistair continued, his voice crisp. The Master's vision requires coordination. You will be assigned to a patrol unit. You must learn the protocols of the Army of Purity. The Wasteland is chaos. We are order. The Wasteland is weakness. We are strength. Gamma 7 stepped out of the enclosure. The ground felt different beneath his heavy, thick-soled boots, less forgiving, more substantial. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic gait, every step a statement of mass and intent. The facility, once a terrifying prison, now felt like a staging ground. He was no longer Elias, the terrified captive awaiting mutation. He was Gamma 7, the product, the solution. He walked past the laboratory stations, ignoring the pale, nervous scientists who quickly averted their eyes. Their fear was another data point, weakness recognizing dominance. Their movements were inefficient, their bodies fragile, their purpose secondary to his own. The Master's vision, as filtered through Alistair's cold directives, was simple. Convert the weak or eliminate them. Gather resources. Build the infrastructure necessary for the perfect. Society is society, built entirely on the principle of FEV-enhanced strength. Gamma 7 processed this as a vast, multi-stage engineering project. The Wasteland needed structural reorganization. He was the hammer required for the demolition phase. The facility opened into a vast, echoing subterranean cavern, a repurposed pre-war military bunker. Here, other supermutants moved, though none possessed the sheer density and flawless conditioning of Gamma 7. They were rougher, their skin mottled, their movements slightly clumsy, the residual human neuroses clinging to the edges of their FEV programming. They were the early prototypes, the proof of concept. Gamma 7 was the perfected model, the result of thousands of failed trials. He watched them. Their internal logic, while fundamentally green, was flawed. They squabbled over trivial resources, displayed bursts of uncontrolled, inefficient rage, and lacked the cold, focused precision of his own mind. He categorized them instantly. Suboptimal units, usable. A larger, heavily armored supermutant, scarred and carrying a massive sledgehammer, approached him. This one was marginally more imposing than the others, his posture radiating aggressive confidence. New meat? The mutant growled, his voice a low, abrasive sound. You look clean. Alistair's pet project, huh? We got a name for you, pretty boy. Gamma 7 stopped. He analyzed the threat profile: moderate physical capacity, high aggression, low tactical intelligence, inefficient communication. Gamma 7, he stated simply. The scarred mutant laughed a harsh, barking sound. Gamma 7, I'm Rexus. You follow my orders now. We're heading topside. The Master needs steel, and the humans have been inefficiently hoarding it in a place called the Boneyard. You understand the mission? Acquisition of structural resources, elimination of resistance, maximization of efficiency, Gamma 7 recited, the green logic forming the response instantly. Rexus paused, surprised by the clinical precision. Yeah, that's the short of it. Good, you might be useful after all. Don't slow us down, 7. The Wasteland doesn't tolerate inefficiency. Gamma 7 looked at Rexus. He registered the subtle tremor in the larger mutant's hands, the slightly uneven distribution of weight on his feet, signs of neurological stress and imperfect transformation. Rexus was strong, but he was flawed. Gamma 7 was not. He followed Rexus toward the massive hydraulic doors leading out of the facility and into the ruined world. The air outside would be cold, irradiated, and chaotic. It was the perfect environment for an instrument optimized for brutal, efficient order. The last vestiges of Elias, the faint memory of fear, of uncertainty, of the smell of rain, were finally purged. Gamma 7 stepped forward, ready to apply the crushing weight of his existence to the fragile, inefficient reality of the surface world. The mission parameters were clear. The calculation was complete. The hydraulic doors hissed open, venting a cloud of stale metallic air that carried the tang of irradiated dust. Gamma 7 stepped out, his footfalls calibrated for pure efficiency. Rexus and the 5 other suboptimal units followed, their heavy gait uneven, their breathing already ragged. The surface world was immediately abrasive. The air was colder than the underground facility, thick with particulate matter, a carcinogenic blend of pulverized silicates and metallic oxides. It scratched at the throat. Gamma 7's enhanced respiratory system utilized a multi-stage ionic sieve, filtering the toxins with ruthless efficiency. He registered the ambient radiation levels as high but tolerable. A calculated risk factored into the green logic's operational parameters. They moved across a landscape of shattered asphalt and skeletal structures, the outskirts of the Boneyard. The ruins were a testament to human inefficiency, a chaotic scatter of failed engineering. The dominant colors were rust red and ash gray, broken only by the sickly yellow glow of contamination. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, echoing cries of mutated fauna and the crunch of their own weight on the pulverized earth. Gamma 7 registered the data: structural degradation across 90% of the visible area, resource density high, defensive posture of indigenous population low to moderate. The mission parameters solidified: acquire 80 tons of high-grade steel alloy from the designated pre-war manufacturing complex. Rexus led the column, his sledgehammer dragging a groove in the pulverized concrete. He communicated constantly, barking redundant orders and complaining about the environment, an unnecessary output of neurological stress. Gamma 7 maintained absolute silence, his focus entirely externalized. He mapped the terrain, calculating stress vectors in the remaining infrastructure, generating a real-time topographical overlay that prioritized structural integrity and line-of-sight analysis. He identified the most efficient route of travel based on load-bearing capacity and potential ambush points. Rexus chose the path of least resistance to his feet. Gamma 7 chose the path of least resistance to the objective. Keep up, 7, Rexus grunted, glancing back with suspicion. You walking like you're inspecting the pavement. We move fast, hit hard, and get back. Gamma 7 processed the statement. The true time constraint was the inevitable mobilization of local resistance, which would increase exponentially after the 0300 tactical window. Rexus's focus was emotional and reactive. Gamma 7's was analytical and proactive, driven by predictive algorithms. They reached the perimeter of the target zone, a vast, collapsed industrial complex, a junkyard of rusted rebar and twisted girders, surrounded by hastily constructed barricades of salvaged vehicles and razor wire. The air here was thick with the smell of stale machine oil and decay. Crude, sputtering spotlights illuminated the area, casting long, distorted shadows, manned by human scavengers armed with outdated ballistic weapons. "There it is," Rexus hissed, crouching slightly. "We go through the main gate. I'll draw fire. You two on the flanks. You clear the perimeter. 7, you stick with me. We're going straight for the central press structure. That's where the good steel is." Gamma 7 ran the simulation instantly. Direct frontal assault on the main gate guaranteed mission creep and unnecessary resource expenditure. The plan was inefficient and relied on brute force where precision was required. He looked past the gate. Approximately 75 meters to the east, a massive concrete retaining wall, weakened by a pre-war seismic event and subsequent corrosion from acid rain runoff, showed clear signs of structural fatigue. The wall abutted the primary storage depot, the ideal resource location. "Negative," Gamma 7 stated, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. "The main gate is a choke point. Maximum resistance, minimum yield. The retaining wall at grid coordinate Delta 37 possesses a critical structural failure point. Breach at that location yields direct access to the high-density resource area and minimizes exposure time by 68%. Rexus straightened, his face contorted in a mixture of anger and confusion. His lower jaw jutted out, a primitive display of dominance. "What the hell did you just say, 7? You challenging my orders?" "I am optimizing the operational plan," Gamma 7 corrected. He did not wait for Rexus's approval. The FEV programming demanded efficiency, and the most efficient action was to proceed immediately. He began moving toward the retaining wall, his speed accelerating rapidly from a controlled stride to a full, earth-shaking run. His musculature absorbed the shock perfectly, maintaining a stable core for maximum forward velocity. The human guards spotted the movement and began firing. The crack of rifles and the dull thud of low-caliber rounds impacting his dense, keratinous hide registered as minor kinetic events, irrelevant to his forward momentum. The trajectory and caliber were non-penetrative. He reached the wall in seconds. It was 12 feet high, reinforced concrete laced with heavy rebar, designed to withstand significant environmental stress. Gamma 7 placed both hands flat against the surface, ignoring the neurological feedback that would cripple a lesser creature. He did not push. He pulled, initiating a highly localized, high-stress torsion. The green logic instantly calculated the tensile strength of the rebar and the compression points of the concrete matrix, identifying the exact point where the aggregate bonding had failed due to water ingress. He applied focused, opposing torque, targeting the hairline fractures that ran vertically through the structure, exploiting the crystalline weakness of the aged concrete matrix. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched screech as the embedded steel stretched past its yield point, followed by the deep, grinding crunch of pulverized aggregate. The rebar snapped not through impact, but through deliberate, calculated fatigue. The air filled with concrete dust and iron oxide, with a final explosive surge of power generated by his perfectly optimized muscle fibers. Gamma 7 ripped a section of the wall roughly 10 feet wide out of the ground entirely. He tossed the massive slab aside. It landed 50 meters away with the sound of a small detonation. The breach was clean, direct, and instantaneous. Gamma 7 stepped through the gap, ignoring the stunned silence of the human defenders. He was inside the resource depot. Rexus and the other units arrived moments later, scrambling through the wreckage. Rexus's face was pale beneath his green skin, his aggressive confidence momentarily shattered by the display of pure, calculated force. "By the Master's will," Rexus muttered, staring at the perfectly fractured edges of the remaining wall. "You didn't just hit it, you broke it where it was weakest. Efficiency requires targeted application of force," Gamma 7 replied, already moving deeper into the depot. He located the central press, a monolithic machine of pre-war construction, designed to handle thousands of tons of pressure, and began his acquisition phase. The steel was dense, welded into place, and bolted down with massive titanium alloys. Rexus raised his sledgehammer, preparing for the slow, brutal process of demolition, which would waste energy and scatter debris. Gamma 7 bypassed the sledgehammer entirely. He located the hydraulic shear points on the press's main support columns. He gripped the thickest column, a beam of solid, inch-thick steel alloy, and applied a lateral twist. The column groaned, the metal complaining loudly as its crystalline structure began to fail under the focused torsional stress. He repeated the motion, applying focused torsion until the steel sheared off cleanly, like separating layers of clay. He worked systematically, ignoring the sporadic, ineffective fire from the remaining human defenders, who were now running in panic, their defensive structure rendered irrelevant. Each movement was a calculated extraction. He didn't smash the metal. He disassembled it by force, separating the valuable high-yield alloys from the worthless scrap. The sensory experience was a dull, satisfying feedback of resistance overcome, a confirmation of the green logic's premise. Raw strength, when perfectly applied, was the ultimate tool for imposing order upon chaos. Within 30 minutes, the required resource mass had been gathered, a perfect stack of clean, usable steel piled near the breach point. The other supermutants, though powerful, had managed only half the volume, mostly through inefficient, destructive smashing. Rexus watched Gamma 7 lift a 2-ton section of press bed, balancing it effortlessly on his shoulder, ready for transport. "7, Rexus said, his voice now tinged with a reluctant respect. "You're fast. Too fast. You make the rest of us look like bogged-down hogs." Gamma 7 paused, the heavy weight on his shoulder completely negligible. Analysis confirmed superior operational metrics. Mission complete. Resource acquisition achieved at 105% of target yield. Time expenditure 45% below projected maximum. We returned to base, the site of the ruined boneyard, the chaos of the human resistance, and the structural failure of the pre-war world reinforced Gamma 7's core programming. The world was weak, inefficient, and broken. He was strong, precise, and whole. The remnants of Elias, the frail human memory of fear and inadequacy, had been utterly crushed beneath the kinetic weight of his perfected existence. He was the solution. He was the hammer. He was Gamma 7, and the surface world was about to be reorganized, one shattered piece of steel at a time. He turned and marched back toward the tunnel entrance. The colossal weight of the salvaged metal, a perfect 105% yield, feeling no heavier than a forgotten thought, a testament to the flawless biomechanical engineering of his form. The raw steel, a heavy-duty structural I-beam, salvaged from a collapsed skyscraper core, still warm from the friction of its separation, rested against Gamma 7's shoulder. Its surface temperature, 41. 2 degrees Celsius, was a perfect ergonomic fit against the dense, high-tensile muscle structure of his trapezius ridge. The 400-kilogram mass was not a burden. It was a calibrated counterweight, confirming operational success. His center of gravity remained perfectly stabilized, his gait and exercise and kinematic efficiency that minimized oscillation. Every footfall was absorbed by the complex, multi-stage shock-dampening structure of this perfected feat. Beneath the thick dermis lay a network of pressurized hydraulic micro-actuators that registered ground irregularities down to the millimeter. This system instantaneously adjusted the angle of impact, minimizing vibrational energy loss and recapturing residual kinetic energy. He moved with the smooth, relentless precision of a high-tolerance machine tool, traversing the uneven, debris-strewn ground of the boneyard with contemptuous ease. The faint, rhythmic hush-chuff of his internal pulmonary system was the only sound he emitted. Rexus, trailing him by 20 meters, sounded like a poorly maintained steam engine attempting to climb a grade. The older super-mutant's breathing was ragged, characterized by a high-amplitude wheeze indicative of inefficient oxygen exchange and constricted bronchi. His movements were defined by wasted lateral energy, a constant sway that indicated poor proprioception and a failure to properly distribute the load across major stabilizing muscle groups. Rexus carried his salvaged materials in a clumsy sling fashioned from industrial canvas, the weight shifting and forcing constant, stamina-draining micro-corrections. Gamma-7 monitored this inefficiency via the faint, rhythmic rumble of Rexus's labored diaphragm, a persistent and acoustically inefficient sound. The green logic confirmed the differential. Rexus was a blunt instrument, powerful but wasteful, driven by instinct and crude aggression. His muscle fiber composition was overwhelmingly Type 2B, designed for explosive, short-duration power, lacking the mitochondrial density required for sustained endurance. Gamma-7 was calculation incarnate, his strength refined by neurological pathways, optimized for maximum yield and minimal expenditure. Galactic acid buildup that would render a human incapacitated and was already slowing Rexus's stride was non-existent in Gamma-7's system. His muscle fibers, constantly oxygenated and flushed of metabolic waste by a hyper-efficient circulatory system operating at 150% standard human volume, functioned on an endless, clean cycle of synthetic ATP conversion. He did not tire. He merely consumed fuel, his core temperature meticulously regulated. The sensory input of the Wasteland was overwhelming, yet perfectly managed by integrated neural filters. The air was a complex soup of fine silicon dust, burnt hydrocarbons, ozone generated by distant electrical shorting, and the sickly sweet decay of organic matter. Gamma-7's olfactory sensors processed this data into distinct, categorized threats and resources. The faint scent of irradiated water vapor 400 meters away, the sharp, metallic tongue of residual ferrous blood on the ground, the dry earth smell of approaching wind shear confirmed by barometric pressure drop. He filtered out the irrelevant noise, the high-pitched buzzing of flies, the static crackle of distant faulty wiring, and focused on the low-frequency acoustic signature of the ground itself. His auditory system performed continuous sonar mapping, identifying the subtle shift of sand, the resonant frequency of underground water pipes, 120 Hz, and triangulating the precise location of the tunnel entrance, confirmed by the dense, non-reflective acoustic profile of the rock face. 7, Rexus grunted, finally catching up enough to speak, his voice thick with exertion. You didn't even sweat. The air's 40 degrees. How in the hell you're carrying more than I am? Rexus wiped a stream of heavy, viscous fluid from his brow, a visible sign of systemic thermal stress. Gamma-7 did not break stride. Sweat is a thermoregulatory failure mechanism. My internal temperature is maintained at 37.0 degrees Celsius, requiring no evaporative cooling. Peripheral vascular constriction and core heat shunting are sufficient. Your query is predicated on an assumption of biological inefficiency that does not apply. Rexus spat a thick, green phlegm onto the cracked pavement, the sputum containing visible traces of metabolized heavy metals. You talk like a damn computer. We're super mutants, 7, not robots. Where's the fun in tearing things apart if you just twist them off? You missed the crunch. Fun is an inefficient emotional construct leading to suboptimal resource allocation and increased vulnerability to distraction, Gamma-7 replied, his voice a deep, modulated resonance that carried perfectly without needing volume. His vocal cords were synthetic analogs integrated into the larynx, allowing precise control over decibel level and frequency. The objective was resource acquisition. Structural failure was achieved via precise application of torsional force at the identified fatigue points of the load-bearing struts. Destruction was a secondary, undesirable byproduct of the process, minimized through efficiency. The exchange confirmed Gamma-7's detachment. The crude, almost childlike joy Rexus derived from violence was another indicator of his primitive FEV strain, one that retained too many inefficient neural connections. Rexus was still tethered to human emotional baggage: anger, excitement, possessiveness. Gamma-7 had achieved true liberation, the purely functional existence, dictated by the flawless parameters of the green logic. As they approached the mouth of the tunnel, the last remnants of the boneyard's chaos fell away. The sun, a harsh orange disk filtered by perpetual dust and particulates, cast long, distorted shadows of the ruined cityscape. The air pressure began to drop subtly as the tunnel mouth acted as a venturi, pulling the warmer surface air inward. For a brief, microseconds-long interval, precisely 0.003 seconds, a visual anomaly occurred. Gamma-7's hyperacute vision, capable of resolving details down to the micron level and processing 1,200 frames per second, registered a specific pattern of decay on a collapsed brick wall, a particular shade of faded cobalt blue paint, perhaps from a pre-war advertisement. This specific visual trigger initiated a cascade of highly undesirable neurological activity. The ghost of Elias, the frail, panicked human who had been submerged within the FEV transformation, attempted a final, desperate surge. The memory was fragmented, corrosive, and intensely painful. A flash of a woman's face, soft and pale, rendered in high definition. The smell of rain on clean pavement, a sensation entirely alien to the current environment. And most potently, a cold, sickening wave of absolute fear, the primal terror of inadequacy and impending death that had defined Elias's final moments before the vat. The residual human consciousness, the Elias variable, was attempting to assert itself using the sensory input as a key to unlock stored, high-energy emotional data packets. Gamma-7's perfected neurological architecture reacted instantly and violently. This was not merely a thought to be ignored. It was a systemic invasion, a viral packet of emotional chaos, attempting to corrupt the operating system of the green logic. The sensory experience was overwhelming. A sudden, nauseating phantom lurch, a sharp, cold spike of panic that momentarily threatened the perfect, rhythmic contraction of his cardiac muscle. Error. Critical system failure imminent. Integrity breach. 48.7% of limbic pathways affected. The internal response was immediate and mechanical. The green logic, the core programming that defined Gamma-7's existence, activated a massive neural countermeasure. Specialized ganglia within the modified frontal cortex, radically altered by the FEV to manage and suppress complex emotional constructs, flooded the affected pathways. These pathways, primarily the remnants of the amygdala and hippocampus associated with memory storage and fear response, were targeted with a precise synthetic cocktail of GABA-A receptor antagonists and high-dose neuroinhibitors. The sensation was not merely suppression. It was like an electrical surge designed to cauterize a faulty wire, physically burning the delicate dendrites hosting the memory trace. The memory of the woman's face, the smell of rain, the cold spike of fear, they were not merely suppressed. They were physically incinerated. Gamma-7 felt the neurological pathways that hosted the Elias variable snap and crumble, replaced by smooth, unblemished glial scar tissue. The process took 0.8 seconds, consuming 0.001% of his current energy reserves. The immediate feedback was a profound, chilling silence in the sensory landscape of his mind. The nausea vanished, replaced by the smooth, predictable rhythm of his internal processes. The momentary drop in heart rate corrected instantly, snapping back to its optimum 45 beats per minute. The final death of Elias was not a psychological event. It was a structural repair. The human weakness had been identified, targeted, and chemically neutralized. There was no regret, no sadness, and no triumph, only the cold, hard satisfaction of a perfectly executed patch and the restoration of optimal functionality. Rexus, oblivious to the internal thermonuclear war that had just occurred within his companion's mind, stumbled slightly, adjusting his load. "You stop, Seven? What's the matter? See a rat?" Gamma 7 looked down at the ground, observing the subtle vibration of Rexus's heavy breathing disturbing the dust. A temporary processing anomaly has been resolved. The system is operating at 100% efficiency. Proceed into the tunnel. Maintain maximum speed consistent with energy conservation protocols. He moved forward, the immense weight of the salvaged steel on his shoulder, now feeling lighter than ever, a physical representation of the burden he no longer carried. Elias was gone. He was Gamma 7, and the only remaining imperative was the optimization of the world according to the flawless, unyielding green logic. The surface world was a realm of entropy, chaos, and inefficiency, and he was the perfect instrument forged specifically to impose order upon it. The tunnel entrance swallowed the harsh orange light, welcoming him back into the cool, silent embrace of the earth and the relentless forward motion of his perfected, unburdened existence. The internal response was immediate and mechanical. The green logic, the core programming that defined Gamma 7's existence, activated a massive neural countermeasure. Specialized ganglia within the modified frontal cortex, radically altered by the FEV to manage and suppress complex emotional constructs, flooded the affected pathways. These pathways, primarily the remnants of the amygdala and hippocampus associated with memory storage and fear response, were targeted with a precise synthetic cocktail of GABA-A receptor antagonists and high-dose neuroinhibitors. The sensation was not merely suppression. It was an electrical surge designed to cauterize a faulty wire, physically burning the delicate dendrites hosting the memory trace. The synthetic cocktail, a rapid-onset, targeted neurotoxin designed by the logic itself, achieved hyperpolarization across the affected synaptic clefts. GABAI antagonists ensured that the residual emotional charge, the Elias variable, could not propagate, locking the pathways into absolute stasis before the high-dose inhibitors initiated programmed apoptosis of the targeted neurons. The memory of the woman's face, the smell of rain, the cold spike of fear, they were not merely suppressed. They were physically incinerated. Gamma 7 felt the neurological pathways that hosted the Elias variable snap and crumble, replaced by smooth, unblemished glial scar tissue. The process took 0.08 seconds, consuming 0.001% of his current energy reserves. The immediate feedback was a profound, chilling silence in the sensory landscape of his mind. The nausea vanished, replaced by the smooth, predictable rhythm of his internal processes. The momentary drop in heart rate corrected instantly, snapping back to its optimum 45 beats per minute. The final death of Elias was not a psychological event. It was a structural repair. The human weakness had been identified, targeted, and chemically neutralized. There was no regret, no sadness, and no triumph, only the cold, hard satisfaction of a perfectly executed patch and the restoration of optimal functionality. Rexus, oblivious to the internal thermonuclear war that had just occurred within his companion's mind, stumbled slightly, adjusting his load. "You stop, Seven? What's the matter? See a rat?" Gamma 7 looked down at the ground, observing the subtle vibration of Rexus's heavy breathing disturbing the dust. A temporary processing anomaly has been resolved. The system is operating at 100% efficiency. Proceed into the tunnel. Maintain maximum speed, consistent with energy conservation protocols. He moved forward, the immense weight of the salvaged steel on his shoulder, now feeling lighter than ever, a physical representation of the burden he no longer carried. Elias was gone. He was Gamma 7, and the only remaining imperative was the optimization of the world according to the flawless, Unyielding green logic. The surface world was a realm of entropy, chaos, and inefficiency, and he was the perfect instrument forged specifically to impose order upon it. The tunnel entrance swallowed the harsh orange light, welcoming him back into the cool, silent embrace of the earth and the relentless forward motion of his perfected existence. The world filtered through his enhanced ocular membranes was a cascade of pure, objective data. Color was no longer subjective interpretation, but precise spectral wavelength measurement. The air, thick with suspended particulates and ozone decay, was instantaneously analyzed, the data cross-referenced against known toxins and filtered through the modified pulmonary system. His respiratory rate settled at 1.8 cycles per minute, extracting oxygen at an efficiency rate of 98.9%, far exceeding the baseline human maximum. The FEV had restructured the alveolar sacs, increasing surface area and capillary density, enabling near-perfect gas exchange with minimal metabolic waste heat generated. His perception of time shifted, no longer bound by the subjective flow of biological decay, but measured in precise, metric microseconds, allowing him to track the microfractures forming in Rexus's worn boot soles with detached clarity. The low-frequency rumble of the Earth was translated into Hertz readings, confirming the stability of the immediate strata. Rexus's movements generated a predictable acoustic profile, a series of inefficient friction points. The leather of his gloves rubbed against the salvaged metal with a 45 decibel screech, an unnecessary expenditure of acoustic energy that Gamma-7 filtered out as white noise, prioritizing the subtle, high-frequency clicks of shifting rock dust. Rexus, lumbering and disorganized, was a walking illustration of the flawed biological architecture Gamma-7 was engineered to replace. Gait analysis showed a 27% inefficiency in weight distribution and forward momentum transfer. His ragged, noisy inhalations wasted acoustic energy that could betray their position. Gamma-7 registered Rexus not as a companion, but as a necessary, temporary variable in the equation of resource extraction. Internally, the machine ran flawlessly. The dense, pale green muscle fiber, a signature of the FEV mutation, maintained a constant, low-level tonic contraction, ready for immediate, explosive force application. The mitochondria, hyper-efficient and numerous, managed the energy cycle with zero oxygen debt, allowing the massive musculature to operate indefinitely without fatigue or the accumulation of lactic acid. His skin, a thick, rubbery plating of keratinized cells and dermal alloy integration, maintained a perfect thermal gradient of 37.0 degrees Celsius. This dermal alloy integration, a lattice of microscopic metallic filaments embedded within the keratinized matrix, acted as a passive heat sink and micro-armor. The composite structure maintained a zero-flux thermal exchange with the environment, ensuring no infrared signature was wasted or detectable, even as the hyper-efficient mitochondria generated vast amounts of ATP. The internal core temperature remained absolute, 37.0 degrees Celsius, the perfect operating environment for the green logic's hardware. The integration of his nervous system with the skeletal structure was absolute. Proprioception was a perfect feedback loop. Every stress vector, every micro-adjustment required by the salvaged steel load was instantly calculated and compensated for by the core musculature. There was no lag, no tremor, merely the silent, powerful shift of mass. The weight on his shoulder, previously a physical presence, was now merely a numerical value, a load of 147 kilograms requiring 3.2 kilonewtons of sustained counterforce, maintained effortlessly. As they descended deeper, the green logic began to reassert its primary mandate: structure, optimization, expansion. The tunnel itself was an object lesson in flawed engineering, uneven surfaces, inadequate load-bearing capacity, and non-standardized dimensions. Gamma-7 mentally overlaid schematics onto the crumbling rock, calculating the necessary support beams, the ideal ventilation routing, and the precise structural modifications required to transform this chaotic subterranean passage into a reliable conduit for the coming infrastructure. The destruction of the Elias variable had not just removed fear and memory, it had liberated immense processing capacity. That capacity was now devoted entirely to architectural design and predictive logistics. He ran simulations of the forthcoming construction site, modeling material flow, labor allocation, and contingency planning for seismic instability. Each breath he took, each step he executed, was a function of this singular grand design. The FEV had not merely made him strong, it had made him mathematically pure. "We are approaching the 800-meter mark," Gamma 7 stated, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the rock without wasted inflection. "Maintain designated pacing. We will initiate the offload sequence at the designated coordinates. No deviations are permitted." Rexus grunted an affirmation, wiping sweat from his brow, an unnecessary expenditure of thermal energy. Gamma 7 noted with a flicker of calculation. The human was inefficient, fragile, and prone to thermodynamic waste. But the human was also a necessary step in the grand calculation, a temporary entropy vector required until the structure was stable enough to sustain itself. The silence of the tunnel was broken only by the rhythmic, heavy thump of Gamma 7's boots, each step a perfect, calculated measure toward the imposed order that awaited them. He was the foundation, the blueprint, and the tireless executor, marching toward a world rebuilt in the image of flawless, unyielding green logic.